Well, we've talked about allotment, we've talked about removals of restrictions, we've talked a little bit about um, the Indian New Deal and how John Collier came along and got restrictions reestablished. So there was this period when you had allotment, and then you would have, when the Berkey Act came around in 1908, and the restrictions were removed faster than they originally intended. A lot of land went into the, excuse me, the private market from the Indian restricted land base, and a very large proportion of the total amount of restricted Indian land went into private hands after the Berkey Act in 1908. But then, in the 1930s, the arrival of John Collier, that would end, and Collier would actually reverse it so that people would no longer be able to get land out of restriction, and land would perhaps even be added to reservations. So this is a, this is a great example of waffling of policy over a significant period of time. The result has been a problem that we know today as fractionation. And that refers to the condition, the legal condition of a parcel of land that has been allotted, placed into trust, and then retained in trust status while it has been passed down through a generation or so to heirs. So people who inherit allotted land that is restricted. That's what we're looking at. That creates this condition of fractionation. So allotted land that is conveyed in fee with restrictions intact after 1934, of course, the restrictions would remain intact. And since 1934, or even earlier, this land, restricted land, has been subdivided among the heirs of various allottees. So the allottee would perhaps have, who knows, 4 or 5 children who would then inherit that land and split it, and then each one of them would have children and pass their share to their children. And so what you wind up with is a relatively small parcel of property, parcel of land, that is owned by a very large number of people over 2, 3 generations. You can imagine large families, 3, 4 generations. You're going to get a division of land to the extent where it really wouldn't make any sense for this many people to own that much, small amount of land. It's not going to be doing them any good, and then perhaps not even going to be concerned about it. So it's often gets abandoned. But let me go through a sort of an example here. The original allottee dies, and in the state of Oklahoma, or within any state, when restricted land in the form of an allotment, but in which it's already been conveyed with restrictions intact, as much of it was in Oklahoma. The original allottee dies without a will, then the allotment itself, the parcel, becomes subject to the process of intestate succession. And all that's just a fancy term for what most people refer to as probate. And that is a matter of state law. Okay? So allotments become subject to state rules of probate. And what that means is that the land has to be divided in equitable interests to all of those people who have some interest in it. So the division of interest among all the possible heirs of a parcel of land. So it's very common for people who don't own a lot of property to die without a will. And if that happens, then you have this long, drawn-out legal process in which the property is supposed to be subdivided among all of the possible heirs. It's expensive and time-consuming. This is why perhaps if your grandparents or parents have a will, then more than likely, if they own a house or have some property, more than likely they will have a trust. They'll have a living trust or an irrevocable trust or a revocable trust, so that they can pass property to their children or to their heirs in the way that they want, rather than having it worked by the local government, by judges. The restrictions on the alienation, however, as we've seen, prevent one heir from buying out any of the others. A restriction on the sale means that you can't, even if there are 4 children in the first generation here, say there's a 160 acre parcel, and it's divided among 4 children. Well, they might actually subdivide it into 40 acres. That kind of makes sense, and that's often the case. There may be a problem if there's a house on that property. Who gets the house, and the 40 acres? But they're still owning this in restricted status. Now, if we just take an example here in which those 4 children have 12 grandchildren, and over time, you see 2, 3, 4 generations, by the present day, there could be as many as 100 great-great-grandchildren owning that original 160 acres, and that's just completely arbitrary, just an example. But those 100 grandchildren are going to own an acre and a half or something like that, an acre and a half interest in that parcel, yet they can't sell it. And the more heirs one has, the more heirs there are, the less the chance of the property ever becoming saleable. Now, whenever land is subdivided and in a condition of fractionation like this, it's very, very difficult to get leases, or even leases approved. So all the leases, remember, if it's restricted land, have to go through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, have to go through the federal government. And so those leases have to be approved by all of the interested parties, all right? Well, Cousin Lewis is nowhere to be found. Nobody knows where he lives. So the courts can't, or the government can't easily go through that approval process to even get a lease on the land. So what happens? Well, probably most of the time what happens is informal stuff. In other words, it becomes extra legal. The use of the land becomes fairly extra legal. And this is, I've talked about Hernando de Soto Pilar before. He's the guy that wrote that book, The Mystery of Capitalism, or the Mystery of Capital, I guess is what it's called. Why capitalism succeeds, in the West and fails everywhere else. And his thesis is that property rights are the key to economic development. Without adequate property rights, you can have property, private property, but there's no guarantee in the ability to hold private property. So De Soto is concerned mostly with the developing world. He says in places like Colombia or let's say Egypt, there are lots and lots of people who own property. They own houses, they own businesses, they own farms, but there's not a tradition of, there is not a solid tradition of recognition and respect of property rights. And that's largely due to government requirements that make it very difficult to file property, to file on property and to establish property rights in the first place. So what happens is over time, people own things, but yet they don't have legal title in a secure sense to the property. So if you don't have secure title to the property, it's very, very difficult to capitalize on that. It's very difficult to use it as capital, mortgage it, or and it doesn't make a lot of sense often to pour money into the property, to invest in it, if you have the possibility, the very real possibility of losing it and of not being able to claim it in the future or to pass it to your heirs. So this is the concept that DeSoto comes up with. He calls it dead capital. That capital that is without clear property rights, or capital that is, for some reason, unable to be utilized for lending as collateral, or it's not capable of entering the formal market and being and working in a capitalist system. That's what it refers to as dead capital. It's just not. It's out of function. It's not functioning. It can't possibly function because its clarity and the rights to the property itself are not clear. Well, I like that topic because that, to me, expresses fractionated Indian land to a T. It is exactly what we have in places like rural Oklahoma, where there may be a pasture that is owned by 46 people because of this restriction and fractionation problem. And because it's owned by so many people, it doesn't make any money for anybody in particular, right? At least not in a formal sense. There may be a gentlemanly agreement between family members or something, but there's not a system there. There's not a property right for one or two people. So this is often the case. There are a lot of people that own a little bit of land, but it's restricted land. Okay. So any questions there? Yeah.
But maybe I missed it, but why can't they, let's say there's just like one uncle who wants the land, how can they get it, sell it anyway?
Well, if it was originally subdivided, right? If it went into interstate succession without a will, then it has to be subdivided like that. Then all it takes, though, is one other person not doing a will to send that parcel of land into the same probate process where it has to be subdivided among all the heirs. Well, if you can't find all the heirs, then because it's restricted land, you can't even lease it. You can't even get the government to clear a formal legal lease. But you could probably do it informally. You certainly can't capitalize it because it's still restricted land. It can't be repossessed. But what the fractionation does is it makes it even almost impossible to utilize the land in a legal sense without owning it. Okay? So this is why what it does is it retards development. It retards the development process because land is without a legal. There's no legal authority to actually carry out contracts.
So like at best, this is what I'm getting. It's like at best, let's say you have land with like a couple ponds, and you want your kids, of course, go out fishing and stuff. So at best, you have to kind of make you're gonna let this whatever cousin or whatever run the place, but
right.
Technically, you can't do anything.
Exactly. Legally and technically, you can't really do much with it. It's just all kind of nebulous, and like I said, it's mostly family gentlemanly agreements of who owns what. But of course, that's dangerous because you get a family dispute, and then you have as what was it Ben Franklin that said, "Good fences make good neighbors." And that's particularly true with family, okay? Family will fight over property very quickly, and it gets nasty. So, exactly, it's difficult to get anything formal and legal acting on this property. So what happens is it gets, if nobody's actually using it and making a living from it, it generally gets abandoned, or at least it's not cared for. There's no reason to spend $5,000 on fence, because who knows who's going to take it over. It's all questionable. Very good question. So, any use of the underlying star part is what I want you to pay attention to when it comes back. Any use is thank you. Any use is informal, and capitalization is irrational. It's not economically rational to spend money to develop a thing. So dead capital. All right. My voice is about dead, Alex. Keep moving here. All right, now I want to jump into hunting and fishing rights. And these are some generalizations about Indian hunting and fishing rights before we get into the man, that's a frog. I think there's a frog in my throat. Before we get into the nitty-gritty laws and stuff that have, in court cases that have fixed this, I want to just say a few things. Four points here. Number one, hunting and fishing rights that are established by treaty or federal statute, like a designation of a reservation. Okay, so treaty or whatever is just as good as a treaty, formal agreement. Those hunting and fishing rights that are established by the treaty are always retained unless they're expressly taken away by subsequent treaties or statutes. And that's almost unique to hunting and fishing rights. Indian hunting and fishing rights are really strong. Because, you think about it, remember what we've talked about with reservations and agriculture and the future of an Indian tribe's population and well-being, that the court said, well, a reservation implies agriculture, and it implies land that you're supposed to make a living off of forever and ever for your people, right? Even though that's, I don't know, surely they didn't think forever and ever, okay? But the legal status keeps it forever. But, think about agriculture. Well, American Indians were relying on the natural environment for food in the form of game and fish a lot longer than agriculture, even if they were already agricultural. So hunting and fishing rights are sort of I guess we could call it the holy grail of Indian land use rights. Hunting and fishing rights are strong. At least they've been upheld in the courts to a large degree. Now, this is kind of a problem. This is kind of a problem because hunting and fishing rights, hunting and fishing, what we say game and fish laws, natural resource regulations deal with resources. Some resources are mobile and some resources are immobile. They don't move around. So boundaries are fine for coal beds, and, maybe timber. Okay. But when it comes to water, which moves over the landscape, and game and fish, which also move from place to place and cross boundaries, then you have a problem, okay? And the federal government has, from the beginning, allowed the states, prerogative of giving the state's purview over those mobile natural resources like water and game and fish. So states have really very little authority to enforce their own game and fish laws in Indian country, even when non-Indians hunt or fish in Indian country. So Indian country is particularly relevant to hunting and fishing rights. Now, most of the hunting and fishing regulations, you saw you lost, you didn't get to see the 16-point whitetail that was taken in Oklahoma recently. A 16-point typical whitetail is unbelievable. Hunting and fishing regulations. So we're in, that deer was taken, was harvested in what way? Well, it's October 24th today, and I guess it was taken a day or two ago. How did the hunter legally kill that deer? Archery, right? It was taken with a bow or a crossbow. You can't use crossbows everywhere, not in every state, but you can in Oklahoma. I don't know if I think it was just a regular bow, a compound bow. But there's a season, all right? You can't hunt deer all year round. And when I saw that picture, I looked at what he was holding. It looked to me like it was a rifle. I thought, what's going on here? And I looked a little closer, and it was a bow. So it's bow season, and that, of course, is a designated time that the state establishes for harvesting whitetail deer, and then for the most the bow season goes from October 1st to January 15th, I think. And then there is also what's referred to as a gun season, which is a rifle season, really. And the rifle season is only about 2 weeks long. Okay? So, and then there is another season. There's an antlerless season. There's a youth weekend, youth deer season. So there are little seasons within that. And then there are also controlled hunts at different times of the year in different locations. The state establishes regulations for hunting, for fishing, and the state attempts to manage wildlife in a way that is sustainable and that satisfies the people, the hunters, and people who fish. And so it's doing this with the intent that it's using a resource, utilizing a resource, managing a resource, a natural resource, in a wise way, often in a very scientific way. So resource management, whether it's wildlife, fisheries, forestry, water, soil, whatever. Natural resource management, especially in the case of those mobile natural resources like wildlife, fisheries, those are almost always handed over to the states by the federal government. The states have authority over these things. The only examples of federal wildlife regulations involve migratory waterfowl that are moving across states and wildlife within federal lands that are established as wildlife refuges or wildlife wilderness areas. That's it. So federal regulations generally are pretty sparse when it comes to hunting and fishing. It's usually up to the states. Okay, so this is why to me this is very, very interesting. States have traditionally had authority over wildlife, but not in Indian country. Okay, not in Indian country. Now, we've talked about Public Law 280, and you know what that is. That's the law that allowed Congress to give some states authority, legal, civil, and criminal jurisdiction within Indian country, within their boundaries. In some cases, it was select Indian country. Some reservation areas were exempted from that, depending on the state. But as you recall, PL 280 and termination, um, uh, oh, these are other factors. So PL 280 handed authority over tribal governments or over tribal lands to the states, right? You're familiar with that. Termination. Termination did away with a lot of tribes tribes as formally federally recognized tribes. So a tribe that has been terminated has lost its federal recognition. Terminated tribes can actually be recognized by their states, but they've lost their federal recognition and therefore they've lost their status with the federal government. Okay? This is just a list. That's why I confused myself here. So we got Public Law 280. We know what that does. We know what termination is. Loss of the federal trust relationship and recognition of being a tribe. And then we have certain groups of Indian people who I'm referring to as offshoots of tribes. What might I mean by that? Offshoots of tribes. Tribes are like families. Well, they are really big families. And families split up sometimes. They have feuds and there are factions, and that they break up sometimes. And tribes that have broken up, or they're tribes that have their own factions that break off, like, can you all think of any here around us in Oklahoma? Are there any tribes that have, are there any federally recognized tribes that have emerged from breakaway groups of larger federally recognized tribes? Yes, there are. In the Creek Nation. In the Creek Nation, there are tribal towns. There are a number of tribal towns that have federal recognition for their locality. They have a distinctive tribal identity, it's legally recognized by the federal government, distinctive from the larger Creek Nation. The United Kituwa tribe, the Kituwa Cherokees, were a group who split away from the Cherokee Nation and gained federal recognition. If you go to Tahlequah, you can go to a casino in Tahlequah and it's run by the Kituwas, not the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. So they're still Cherokees, but they have a different federal recognition. So these are offshoots of tribes, and then there are aggregated tribes. You know what aggregated tribes are? What's that mean? It's the opposite of breakup. Tribes that were usually involuntarily brought together and placed on one reservation, and so after so many years they've intermarried, and there's only one tribal council established, after 1934. An example would be the Cheyenne and Arapaho, or the Wichita Caddo Shawnee group over around Anadarko. Okay? So there are Indian tribes who are actually amalgamated, sort of concrete the tribes, even though people might trace their ancestry, of course, through to different lines in the family. The tribal entity itself is a compound tribe of some sort. By the way, the Choctaws and the Chickasaws used to be one tribal group, and then the Chickasaws broke away formally and established their own boundaries down in southern. So there are a lot of examples of that. There are contingents of people in the Creek Nation who consider themselves Uchi, and they don't even have the same linguistic tradition as the Muscogee speakers in the Creek Nation. There are people in the Cherokee Nation who identify as Delaware and Shawnee because they have that family line within that tribe. All right, so there's PL-280, there's termination, there are offshoots of tribes like the Kituah, there are aggregate tribes like the Cheyenne and Arapaho function as one tribe. And even in cases where you have lands ceded to the federal government in which Indian title has been extinguished, isn't that kind of the ultimate? It's possible that Indian hunting and fishing rights can be retained off reservation. Fascinating. So, American Indian hunting and fishing rights can be very durable. Right? They can be very durable, surprisingly durable, at least as they have been interpreted by the courts. Now, in the United States, there are a lot of different federal agencies that are involved with hunting and fishing and wildlife management. The most important, the most direct authority over federal wildlife and fish regulations is the National Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a branch of the Department of the Interior. And this particular agency doesn't have a huge amount of land to work with. They have relatively small areas. They do have some authority over federal lands. And they actually had more authority until Nixon came into office and established in 1975, after he left office, President Ford passed as you know, what is it called? Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. That's what I mean by the self-determination policy. After the self-determination policy, game and fish management were pretty much given over to tribal governments. So this is another example of self-determination. The tribal governments have taken initiatives, or they have the authority. A lot of them haven't bothered to even worry too much about game and fish laws, but they have a lot of authority. This is kind of a frontier for tribal governments to manage wildlife. They have the authority to manage wildlife on a lot of their lands. All right, so I think that's good news. What do y'all think about that? It's kind of interesting, huh? And of course, the problems arise when non-Indians when non-Indians question the rights of Indians to utilize wildlife and fish resources. And this has been a real troubled area during the second half of the 20th century. The second half of the 20th century has, there have been a lot of disputes between Indian use and non-Indian use of wildlife. Can you all think of any in particular? Hunting, fishing. See, what happens is the states, well, we'll get into this a little bit more. Let's move on. Whoop. Okay. Here's a case from 1968, and it involves the hunting and fishing rights and an example of a tribe that was terminated. What's that mean to be terminated? I'll be back. No, not that. That's a different termination. In the case of the Menominee tribe up in Wisconsin, the tribe was had its trust relationship terminated by the federal government, and even though they were terminated, the members of the tribe were found to retain their treaty-based hunting and fishing rights. as one of those bullet points on the last slide indicated, termination really doesn't do much to end hunting and fishing rights for American Indian people. So if they lose their tribal council, they lose their federal recognition, they're not going to lose their hunting and fishing treaty rights. Okay? Now, if Congress has the ability to expressly remove their rights because of plenary power, but hasn't ever happened, I don't think. Congress generally allows tribal hunting and fishing rights to remain. So this is a caveat. As long as Congress does not expressly pass jurisdiction to states over wildlife and fisheries, or abrogate treaty rights, and that doesn't happen very often, then they remain with the tribe. So this is actually a real critical part when there is a dispute over how many salmon somebody can take, or fishing and hunting outside of the state designated seasons, okay, which is one of those, that's a part of the rights. Okay? In this case, the Menominee in 1854 were granted a reservation in the state of Wisconsin under a treaty known as the Treaty of Wolf River. And the line in the treaty that was significant was, in quotes, for a home to be held as Indian lands are held. Right? That is what wound up being very significant to establishing and future recognition of hunting and fishing rights on Indian land. In other words, as Indian lands are held, right? So this is one of those federal promises that have been used to retain hunting and fishing rights even when the reservation is gone, even when the tribe is terminated. What happened was Wisconsin attempted to enforce state game regulations over Indians. Okay, even with the tribe, even with the tribal council and the tribe defunct, Indian people were recognized as having the right or being outside of the jurisdiction of the state when it came to game and fish. Now, of course, this upset a lot of non-Indians, just like it always does. Because, well, why? I'll let you answer that. You all are smart.
We're restricted, I guess. Like, because we're not using.
Why are you restricted? Why do we even have these regulations?
And, stop overkill.
Exactly, yeah. So state regulations were established mostly in the 20th century, mostly in the earlier 20th century, if not just the very late 19th century. Hunting and fishing regulations were initiated as progressive reforms to save wildlife and to try to recuperate fisheries when they had already been overexploited. So if you're an outdoors woman or outdoorsman these days, you probably respect hunting and fishing regulations. That's just part of the culture. You don't hunt 30 minutes after sundown because you know that's the time. Okay, you stop it then, or before 30 minutes before sun up. You know, so you follow those regulations. You report. You tag your deer or your turkey. You don't shoot more than your limit of quail or dove or whatever. Okay? You respect those regulations because, well, if you do that, then at least the state has the idea that the game will be more, will continue to be abundant enough for you to hunt. And of course, it's the sportsmen and sportswomen who pay license fees who purchase firearms and fishing equipment and pay the taxes on those, specific taxes on those items, particularly firearms, federal firearms taxes. That money, that tax money, is earmarked for the state wildlife agencies. Okay, you all know that. So every time you buy a box of shotgun shells, I'm going to think of it. I just remembered I had a shotgun shell following me around today. Every time you buy a box of shotgun, is it legal to have a live shotgun shell in the classroom? What? Here you go. Hit it with a hammer. Okay. So anyway, it's just 6 shot. It just be a mess. Wouldn't hurt too bad. Anyway, whenever you buy a box of shotgun shells, then the tax is going into the federal treasury, and then all of the money that you spent, say in the state of Oklahoma, I think it's allocated by the number of hunters within the state. So the state receives money, to support wildlife programs from those sorts of taxes. So, tell the environmentalists that the more shotgun shells you buy, the more rifle cartridges you buy, the more you are conserving that wildlife. All right. Anyway, so Wisconsin attempted to enforce state regulations against Native Americans. And the people who get really upset about that are the sportsmen and sportswomen who are following those regulations and love nature and love wildlife and respect it and want it to be there forever. Because they view the native peoples as violating conservation laws that were put into place to protect wildlife and to maintain that resource. So they view the Native Americans as exploiting that resource, breaking the rules. Okay? And that can bring about some serious confrontations. Okay. Some more stuff. Sorry about the slide turning. I'm trying to use this. So for tribal members, even members of tribes that have been terminated, they tend to retain treaty-based hunting and fishing privileges, and they tend not to be subject to state fish and game laws. And that's been the case since 1968. Go back and see. Oh, this is a different one. Back here. 1968 is the Menominee tribe versus the United States. Okay, so this established strong hunting and fishing rights for Native Americans in the United States. Now, here's another one. In 1999, not too long ago, only 20 years ago, we have another case that involved the Mille Lacs Band of Chippewa Indians in Minnesota. Now, you've seen that term before, usufructuary. Can somebody recall what that meant for me? Yes, exactly. Commonly held resources can be claimed by those who are actively using them. So usufructuary right is a way of allowing people to claim property. They don't get to own it outright forever and ever. They get to utilize it for as long as they are utilizing it. It's a use it or lose it scheme, or use it or lose it policy. So for those usufructuary rights to land ceded to the United States by treaty, lands that lose their they lose their original Indian title. Okay? But lands that are ceded, or treaty lands that are ceded, This concerns usufructuary rights to land ceded to the United States by treaty. Treaty ceded lands but granted tribe rights. What does that mean? To hunt, fish. Oh, okay. The treaty ceded the lands, in this case, the Treaty of St. Peter's back in 1837. The treaty ceded the lands, but then granted the tribe the rights to hunt, fish, and gather wild rice. So it's sort of like, we own the land now, but you all can still use it for a while. That's what they put in the treaty. Whoops. And so the treaties are often problematic like this, but they have to be followed because of the law of the land. So this particular one in the White Pine Treaty of 1837 had basically handed over usufructuary rights even though the land had been ceded. Okay? So the question was, and this region that was involved included parts of Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Those states came about after the treaty, after 1837. So the treaty preceded the states, and other treaties were made with other bands of Chippewa, and those later treaties were a little bit different. So this was really problematic. The question is, all right, they got this one treaty where they get to have shared rights over fish and game in this area, but then there were a number of other treaties where they were kind of more specific over hunting and fishing. So the other treaties made with the other bands of Chippewa had language that differed. And in 1850, the president, the executive branch, used it to force removal to unceded lands, assuming the executive branch could exact cession of land. Well, that was a mistake. The new states then ignored the rights of the Indians to use land for like 140 years. So this was kind of like winners' rights, remember that? Where you had this legal precedent established, and then the federal government kind of blew it off for about 70 years. It was even longer. In this case, the hunting and fishing rights had pretty much gone dormant over 140 years. And in 1990, okay, way after the Collier era and then termination, in 1990, the Mille-Lac Band of Chippewa filed a suit against the state of Minnesota that basically claimed that original treaty had given them hunting and fishing rights. And the courts interpreted it as legitimate, and they won the case after a really long, drawn-out process, 1999. So it took 9 years, 10 years practically, to get this decision. Now, what did this do? It established it recognized that the admission of a state to equal footing with the other states, that is, when they gain statehood in a organic act, typically, or when they're signed into actual statehood, not just being a territory. But when they gain equal footing with the other states, that's not inconsistent with the continuation of the Indian treaty rights. All right? That is really significant. In other words, even in like the state of Oklahoma, western half was a territory, and then it was Indian territory and Oklahoma territory were brought in as one state in November 16th of 1907. Even after it's established as a state, Indian hunting and fishing treaty rights are not erased. They're still there. Well, this has led to some really interesting things in the area of wildlife conservation. Let's look at some more examples. actually, I want to back off from that, and we'll save it for next time. I want to ask you if you're familiar with this story. Who are the political allies of American Indians for the most part in the United States? Take the political party, seems like. Okay, well, yeah, for the most part, I think. So where would you suppose environmentalists and American Indians usually see things? Do they usually see things in common, or are they at odds with them? You got to go back to the 1960s, I guess, and what was that old, I think he was an Italian actor, but he had the stage name of Iron Eyes Cody. He was the guy that was sitting on a horse, looking over the interstate, and foggy, in a smoggy city, and and somebody throws out a beer can or something, or some trash, out of fast food trash, and it was back in the days of campaign to stop littering, right? And so he turns to the camera and there's a tear going down his face. Iron Eyes Cody, famous guy, Italian, anyway, that was a good example, perhaps, of how the environmental movement sort of co-opted. Today we would say, what do they call it? Cultural appropriation. Yeah, cultural appropriation of the environmental movement of the Indians, of the Native Americans. Because in the 1960s, everybody was, feeling sorry for the Indians and making movies about that and so forth. And the environmentalists plugged into that, right? So they kind of assumed the Native Americans were on their side. Well, it wasn't that way when the Makah tribe of Washington State decided that because their traditional game, the traditional species that they like to hunt in the old days, had come back from serious endangerment, that they were probably entitled to start hunting again. Right? So what was it that they were hunting? That's a good guess. Grizzly bears are still endangered, even in Yellowstone National Park, where they're killing calves. What else? That's not it. Wolves? Huh?
Yeah, wolves may come back.
Okay. Those are the food source. You're not eating wolves, not eating bears.
Say it again.
What is the species that the Makah tribe of Washington State?
Whale.
Yes, it's a whale. Yeah, they wanted to go on a whale hunt. Okay. Now the environmentalists are fit. I like whales. Okay. Myself, I wouldn't eat one, but I don't have anything against people who, it's the tradition, they want to do that. Of course, the Japanese have a tradition of eating whale too. But anyway, these tribal members, they said, look, we ought to have the right to go out and hunt whale. And and they wanted to use some traditional stuff. They dug out canoe, like the Pacific Northwest people. And they wanted to use harpoon, do it the old-fashioned way. Lots of blood and gore, and make it a cultural thing. Well, you know the story now. Do you remember this story? You probably read about this. Another part.
I just remember that it was involved in whale. I believe they still have that.
Yeah. They got some kind of special deal that they could go out and kill maybe one or four, something like that, as a tribal. But the environmentalists said harpoon isn't going to cut it. That's too cruel. you got to use high-powered rifle. So now they go out with they chase them down with 30-06 or something, shoot them, and bring them in. Need them. It's a harvesting of a natural resource. So what I was trying to get at is, the Ironized Cody alliance between environmentalists and Native Americans works most of the time, but not all the time, right? So Greenpeace was really at odds with the Macaw tribe on that. Anyway, well, that's enough, and it's about time for lunch. Go have a whale burger. Yeah, I'm just kidding. All these, I know some of you are really wondering about me bringing shotgun shells to class and talking about killing whales. I don't want to kill whales. All right, have a good weekend, and like I said, I was telling Reese, I'm going to try to get this stuff up online for you. So we can get some test questions. Have a good one.
Hey, just out of curiosity, when will the quizzes